Good afternoon, everybody. DMGeezerjim here to continue along in our series on dungeon mastering. Kind of starting to put together a playlist with videos to help people that are either interested in becoming dungeon masters, learn how to do it, get comfortable with a lot of the stuff that's going on with it. And if you're an experienced dungeon master, maybe there's some stuff you can learn out of this as well. But this is one, and I don't even know how long this series is going to be because let's be honest, being a dungeon master, while anyone can do it and anyone should do it, there is a lot that goes to it, and sometimes there's so many moving parts that go into being a dungeon master. I felt the best thing to do is just to break it down piece by piece, segment by segment, and make a video series about it. So thanks for joining in. This is actually going to be episode 2. Episode 1 was just an intro to who I am. So kind of let's go ahead and just in no particular order. The series isn't necessarily start to finish. If you do all of these in order, then you're going to be good to go. Because sometimes it's just I get inspired or led by one of the discussions we were having to go into the next step. So promise, as a body of work, I'm going to cover everything that you need to know to get into dungeon mastering. Most of this is opinion predicated by experience. This is what works for me. May not necessarily work for every dungeon master out there. There's no one way of being a dungeon master. But there are some accepted and understood practices that go with a dungeon master, being a DM, regardless of your edition, regardless of your main focus. One of the big ones is rules. Just as a caveat, we are looking at all of this from a 5th edition perspective. A lot of the theories, the holistic, the strategic, if you will apply to any tabletop RPG, any of the editions in Dungeons and Dragons, but just for the purposes of continuity, we're going to be talking for 5th edition. That's the most popular edition, and honestly, based on a lot of the social media feeds that I follow, some of the stuff that I work with, that seems to be the one that most people are asking, how do I be a DM? How do I play this game? What do I do? So let's get into it. The first and foremost thing I'm going to recommend, again, here's a caveat. If you're a part of the whole OSROGL, screw D&D Beyond, screw Dungeons & Dragons, you're probably not listening to me anyway. So that's good. Because a lot of what I'm going to tell you might go against your moral code of supporting the big bad company. I don't care about that. I can bear out convenience for us. But Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. The basic rules are freely available to anybody off of D&D Beyond or off of the Wizards of the Coast site. So we're going to start with those because if you're a dungeon master, one of the things that you'll find yourself doing very often is educating rules, saying, yes, that's legal, no, that's not. How about we try this instead? I like your idea, but according to the rule, it won't work. Let's do that. That's a lot of what we spend our time on. The yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. A lot of people are like yes and or no but, or it doesn't matter. You'll find your style. But before you go into any interpretations of the rules, it's important to understand the rules. I always recommend people understand the baseline before you start making alterations. If it sounds cool, and you want to do it for your group, go ahead and do it. But understand where the deviation came from in regards, in the hope of maintaining balance. What sounds really good at level 3 breaks your campaign at level 7. You know, sometimes if you don't have a good foundation in the rules and the strategy. So let's go ahead and start. We'll use this one. I'm using D&D Beyond. You can make a free account here. You don't have to spend a penny on this website, but you do get access to the basic rules, which is what we're going to start with. If you are interested in being a dungeon master, certainly, obviously, players and dungeon masters both should read this. If nothing else, you should sit down and read through all of this information to understand the basic rules of D&D. I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on character creation. That's more for a player video. We'll handle that in a different series. But in regards to a dungeon master, you need to know how the player characters are made. You need to be aware at least how to access the races so you can plan accordingly. Make sure that the chosen species / race, whatever term we're using this month, fits within your campaign and your adventure idea. We'll talk about session -1 in my next video. Basically, that's the DM prep for session 0. And a lot of what I'm talking about for character creation is part of session -1, for lack of a better term. But yeah, be aware of the classes, be aware of the races. I work from a mindset where I don't care what my characters play as long as it fits thematically within the setting. I adjust according to their classes. If you got a group of 4 people that all want to play a bunch of rogues, you can do that. Don't worry about the whole idea of the Holy Trinity. Although there's a lot of what am I trying? Popular culture, gaming culture, RPG culture has gone from being tabletop to video game back to tabletop. The current itinerations of tabletops are still trying to carry over some of the recognized terms, aka the Holy Trinity, the tank, the DPS, the healer. A lot of people get into D&D coming out of a video game environment, an MMO environment, thinking, okay, well, who's going to be the healer? I'll be the tank. You can be the DPS. That's not necessary in Dungeons & Dragons, guys. There's millions, hundreds of monsters out there. There's a bunch of different things that you can do to address that if your group doesn't want to run your idealized Holy Trinity of characters. Don't feel obligated by that. We'll get into that on in encounter and campaign planning sections. But be aware in regards to what you plan on running your adventure, how these species, the races and classes that your characters are choosing are going to impact your planning. So you need to be aware of the races, their racial abilities, all that. Don't have to have them memorized, just don't be afraid to look them up. You know, that's kind of like what we were talking about in our previous video. There's entirely too much content and way too many damn rules and way too many words to try to memorize them all. Don't feel obligated to memorize everything, but be sure that you're at least, you know where to look when it comes time to find it. Step-by-step character, creation of character, races, classes, that's all kind of normal. Personality, background, that's going to go into the session -1/campaign planning, when we're talking about incorporation of backstories. Are they important? Are they not? Equipment, you need to be familiar with equipment. Equipment is a large part of the game. You don't have to have everything memorized. The vast majority of stuff, it's going to have the stat blocks ready to go, built in with D&D Beyond. If you're not using D&D Beyond, you might need to make sure that you have a quick little table to keep track of all this kind of stuff. Print the rules out, whatever you want to do. Spreadsheets, quick and easy. But yeah, you want to be familiar with the cost of the weapons, the basic damage, and the damage type, as well as the properties. Light, finesse, two-handed, light, thrown, versatile, light, so on and so forth. All of these have specific properties. Caveat, the whole property thing is supposed to change in 5.5. I don't want to address that right now. I'm talking about what's in front of us. So there's a few weapon properties that you need to be aware of in regards to being a dungeon master as their effects go. Number 1, light. You'll have a lot of people that do the offhand bonus action offhand attack. A lot of people forget that unless you have the associated feats, you can only do that if you're wielding light weapons in both hands. That's one of the first and quite most often messed up. I was guilty of running that thing for about 4 or 5 months before I finally reread it and went, wait a minute. You can't main hand a Morning Star and offhand a longsword unless you have these feats. There's no point in having the feat if you're going to let people do that. So, you know, that's one of those things that knowledge of the system is going to help you in planning. Know the difference between a heavy weapon. What does reach mean? Reach means you can go out to 10 feet instead of 5 feet. Little bitty things that you can learn out. A finesse weapon is going to allow you to use your dexterity. No, versatility is dexterity or strength. No, I'm sorry, I had it the wrong way. You could use dexterity or strength for your modifier depending on that. Versatile means one-handed or two-handed. You can swing with one-handed for 1d8. You can swing it for two-handed with 1d10 damage. So, oh shit. So the versatility is a little bit of a quick keyword searches. You need to be familiar with the keyword, the properties of the weapons. That's really kind of it as far as equipment goes. Magic items, a whole different plethora of stuff. You're not going to memorize them. You're going to be looking those up as you go along. Get that out of your brain. You're not obligated to memorize every potion in existence. You're not obligated to memorize every item in existence. No. You need to have an understanding of the properties and how those interact with the action economy. So that's the important thing to understand in regards to rule absorption on day 1. Understand, what the races are, what the classes are, how they're going to interact with your world. Don't be afraid to look them up as you need to for reference. Understand the properties on your weapons, because let's be honest, short of spellcasters, the majority of the way your party is going to interact with their environment is through a weapon. So make sure you understand how the weapons, the tags, the properties, proficiencies, all that kind of stuff. Ammunition, that's in campaign details. If you want to track it, that's up to you and your party, so on and so forth. Improvised, silver, specials, so on and so forth. So that's really all you need to worry about in regards to equipment, in my opinion. Make sure you understand weapon properties, proficiencies, the difference between a simple and a martial weapon. That's kind of it for equipment, man. Everything else you can just kind of pick up as you go. Customization options, multi-classing. I'm going to tell you straight up, as a new dungeon master, do not mess with multi-classing right out the gate. At least play one campaign, one adventure series as straight classes before you start playing with multi-classing. You're going to have some very powerful builds at low levels, and you're going to have some people that are crying bloody murder because they're gimped at higher levels. Balancing, we'll worry about that in a different segment. Playing the game, ability scores. This is where it gets thick. This is what you need to have on hand. This is the kind of information as a dungeon master you really need to have it memorized. You need to know this kind of stuff. You don't need to know the modifier table, but you need to be aware of the minimum and the maximum stats, the minimum being 1, the maximum being 30. Anything that goes outside of those, below 1 you're dead, above 30 you're breaking the mechanics. Bounded accuracy is the term they use. Game tested mathematical systems that prove as long as we don't exceed these limits, these rolls will, the die rolls will provide what we need in a fair and balanced state. They didn't nail bounded accuracy all the way, but the last thing you want to do is go messing with it even farther by giving someone a strength of 40 and having to make up stats from there. So yeah, make sure that you understand the minimum and the maximum of abilities. What does each ability do? Strength, strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. Each of these, in addition to making up your player's characters, they all have an impact on their skills and their saving throws. So you should have a decent idea of that. If not, spend the time rereading it, make sure you understand it. Advantage, disadvantage. This is one of the big variable mechanics in Dungeons and Dragons. Rather than additional stacking modifiers that you would see out of 3rd edition, rather than percentage dice, which we used for fine-tuned tasks in 1st edition, 2nd edition, we're going with advantage, disadvantage. Basically, advantage means you roll 2 d20s in any d20 contest, and you take the highest of the 2, and then you add your modifier to it. Disadvantage is the other way. You take the lowest of the 2 rolls and then add the modifiers to it. That's it. You'll use advantage, disadvantage a decent amount through your campaign. It's a nice way to customize if you're not sure of a difficulty check for something and you want to make it a little harder, have them roll with disadvantage. If you want to give them an easier shot at it because they did some really good dialogue up to that point, and I want to roll persuasion to see if this guy goes ahead and gives us our stuff, give them the advantage on it if they've done the work in advance. Advantage and disadvantage, there's some given terms. For example, if you are attacking with flank in some optional rule, flanking can give you an advantage on an attack. Certain character abilities will give you advantage. Certain things will require you work in disadvantage. These are terms. These are mechanics that happen in every single game that I play. Combat, diplomacy, shopping, it doesn't matter. Advantage, disadvantage is something that's important for you to use. Proficiency bonus. Now, if you're using D&D Beyond or any of the other virtual tabletop software-based programs, proficiency bonuses are worked in. If they're not, you need to be aware. If you're going pen and paper, you need to be aware of your players' proficiency bonuses. Just jot them down on a card somewhere, keep track of them. Because this is what's going to apply to skills. This is what makes it easier for your characters to use their skill rolls. That a skill roll ability check is an interactive term. The vast majority of non-combat encounters are taken care of with an ability check. That means that you've got a skill in persuasion. We're going to use that. I use persuasion a lot because I hate the existence of it as a DM. Editorial comment there. Why are we going to be role-playing if you can just push the persuasion button and get what you want? Now, fam, I don't work that way. That is a little bit of a homebrew on me. But point being, You have this thing here, task difficulty, very easy, easy, medium, hard, very hard, nearly impossible. This says typical difficulty classes. These are your baselines. You are not obligated in any way, shape, or form to use these. As a matter of fact, feel free to make an 18 once in a while, a 17, a 12. It doesn't matter. But the difficulty guidelines are there to help you prepare. These are not set in stone, but these are the industry standards that you'll see within most publications. D&D considers a DC 15 medium. What that means is when you're adding your bonuses to it, if you're doing an athletics check, you're trying to jump across and grab a tree limb, for example. You're going to decide on the difficult check. If you don't want to make it too hard, you make it a easy task of 10. Without any modifiers, that means your player's got a 50-50 chance of beating this task, which sounds more like a medium, right? But remember, everyone's got skill modifiers. Unless the dude's got a strength of 6, they're probably going to have, well, at that point, they have a -1. But some of your classes are going to have their strength bonus plus their proficiency bonus added to athletics. So a medium of 15 is truly medium because there's still a 40% chance that they'll fail, 60% chance that they'll succeed, 40% chance that they'll fail once you add the ability modifiers in. Okay, we're understanding there? Ability checks are a big thing. This is your control valve as a dungeon master to determine the difficulty of any non-combat task. Negotiating for a price, looking for investigating, doing a history check when they're spending some time in a library, spending an hour to research. All of the skill stuff is taken care of in ability checks, and those are defined by DCs, difficulty classes, difficulty checks. Okay, keep that in mind. Those are your baselines. You have the freedom to add to that. This is where advantage disadvantage comes in. If the task is hard, but they've got the librarian helping them look through it, maybe you give them advantage on that hard roll instead, or maybe you just drop the difficulty. It's up to you. That's one of those things that you as a DM have a little bit of fun to play with if your party. If they love advantage, disadvantage, find more opportunities to use those. If they're really not about that, then alter your difficulty classes, your base DC checks. Cool? Next thing to know in regards to that is contests. Contests are contested actions. I want to wrestle you. I don't want you to wrestle me. Now we're contesting it. You're rolling your strength against my strength, or your athletics against my dexterity / acrobat, maybe. I want to use my ability to dodge away because you're a big burly bastard. That is where you will decide on a dungeon master which skills you will use in this contest. You can go straight attributes, strength versus strength. You can go skill, athletics versus athletics. You can, and you have some room to play around in there, but that's a contest. Skills, we've been talking about that up to this point. Skills are in relation to the ability checks and difficulties. You don't need... You need to know all of them. You need to have an understanding what each of them can do. Some of them are even interchangeable. Athletics and acrobatics can sometimes be changed. Now, you never want to use acrobatics for lifting up a big, heavy gate, but jumping from one ledge to another, you have the opportunity to go acrobatics or strength. Stealth, sleight of hand, things like that. We'll get into the whole stealth surprise thing. I could spend an hour talking about that on its own and not do a good job of it. Passive checks. Passive checks are something that you need to be aware of. DMs handle those differently. I'm going to do a specific part on skill rolls. We're just talking about rules that you need to be aware of prior to your game. Understand the idea behind passive checks. That'll be more. I'll give you much more information on how to manage passive checks when we're doing a dungeon simulation. Basically, the idea is they're so aware that by default they notice things out of the corner of their eye. And you'll have a lot of characters that jack up their passives to 17, 18, 20 and go, no, I see everything automatically because of my passive. That's what I'm talking about as far as a balanced thing that we handle separately in the heat of combat, in the heat of the adventure. Group checks, each ability. This is going to break down and give you some examples. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is part of the basic rules that help you as a fledgling dungeon master or a different system coming into 5e, whatever. If you're trying to get a grasp on it, these are going to break it down really well and give you all of your data. One thing that is forgotten often is your strength is also determining your lifting, carrying capacity, jumping, and all that kind of stuff. Acrobatics, movement, things like that. So understand the abilities. Lastly is a saving throw. These are always done against your stats based on an attack. A poison is going to hit your constitution. An entrapment, entanglement spell, something restraining you, is going to hit your strength. If you're trying to charm your target, they're going to save with a wisdom, etc., etc. Sometimes charisma, but by and large, every spell that is used or every ability that is used for you as a dungeon master, remember, it's going to tell you what to counter with. You don't have to memorize all of the saving throws. You don't have to memorize all the conditions when they'll apply. You don't have to build a big old honking table of it. Saving throws are handled on an as-needed basis, and most of your adventures or conditions or monsters will give you the numbers you need for the save. So don't get freaked out. It's not a bunch of data you got to memorize. You have to understand the concept of when they're used. Okay, each class gets proficiency in a couple of the saving throws, so on and so forth. The DC will be determined sometimes by the strength of the monster, sometimes by the strength of the magic caster. We'll get into all of that when we do the magic section. Man, there's going to be so many sections in this damn thing, right? It's going to be a 25,212 part series. I'm kidding. Hopefully not. But anyway, so we've gone through playing the game, adventuring, time and movement, speed, environment, social interaction. We're definitely going to go over a half hour today, so I'm going to apologize for that. Time. Time is a factor that you need to keep track of as a dungeon master, but it is abstract. The only time that you need to track time is in combat. Well, that's a bad way to say that. You're tracking time constantly, whether it's the passage of time as your party migrates across 7 days of a caravan travel, and you're breaking it down by 8-hour periods, 12-hour periods, days, whatever you're tracking time. But in the heat of combat, time is important yet abstract. The idea, when we get into combat, your turn is broken down into rounds, okay? We'll get into that in the combat section, but it goes from 6 seconds up to a minute, up to 10 minutes, up to 1 hour, up to your discretion at that point, how you're managing time. You really shouldn't ever have to do a minute-by-minute accounting of your group's time unless they're actually engaged in initiative and in combat. Everything else at that point is abstract. Scales of hours, scales of days, scales of weeks. I would never do weeks. You're losing a lot of game time unless you're in that downtime period. We'll discuss that later. Rounds is a 6-second span of time. Movement. Every character has a base movement speed, okay? Most of them are 30, some of them are 25, some of them are 40. Lots of different things that increase that. Movement is one of the huge things that you need to keep track of, you need to pay attention to. Whether it's forced travel through wilderness adventures, in which you have this nice little chart here. It's overly simplified, guys. 24 miles per day on a normal pace. It's about standard. I think D&D did this just to simplify. 5e did this just to simplify the tables. If you're heavy duty into all this shit, go pick up the first edition Wilderness Survival Guide. That's going to break it down to a foot per round, a distance per round movement according to all of your different terrain types. Not necessary to go that deep in 5th edition. Understand your basic movement is 30 feet. That's the baseline. Everything else is up or down from there. 30 feet equals 6 squares on a battle map. Okay. Difficult terrain is a simplification, and it's a really nice simplification. If the terrain is going to require any sort of navigation, any sort of care, a bunch of broken rocks, if you step wrong, you're going to twist your ankle. Deep sand, and as you move around, you're losing your balance. That is all difficult terrain, and it's very simple. You just you double the cost of movement. You half their movement rate, whatever you want to say. If it normally takes them 5 feet to move through this square, and it's difficult terrain, it costs 10 feet of their 30 feet of movement. That's it. That's one of the 5th edition simplifications that I really enjoy, really love. It keeps it nice and smooth and simple. Difficult terrain costs twice as much for your party to move through. You can use difficult terrain, to really change up the scope of a battlefield and encounters. Climbing, swimming, and crawling. Unless you have the listed climbing, swimming, or crawling speed, which means the creature is native to swimming, climbing, or crawling, spiders, etc., It's considered difficult terrain. It costs 1 extra foot, 2 extra feet in difficult terrain. So it could cost them almost as much as 3 times to climb along a craggy, boulder-strewn, fractured cliff ledge as they navigate the canyon. Normally, it would take them 1 foot to go 1 foot, but because it's difficult terrain, it's going to take them 2 feet. And now they start climbing up one side of this. This is now 3 feet. So, in a normal 30-foot movement person without any of the abilities is going to only be able to climb 10 feet up during their round. Okay? Jumps, strength jump, high jump, all of that. This is where math comes in. When you make a long jump, you cover a number of feet up to your strength score if you move at least 10 feet on foot. So if you take a running jump and your strength is 18, you can jump 18 feet. When you make a long jump, you can only leave half the distance. So if you're just standing where you're at, you go half of your strength. So if you're sitting there at a strength of 10, you got a 5-foot standing jump, which is I'm sorry, man, that's a hell of a jump. But again, simplification is a good thing. Make sure to read this section on movement. Make sure that you're understanding it very well. Movement is part of everything in Dungeons & Dragons. Whether it's moving along as a caravan, whether it's exploring the mountain, whether it's coming through the woods, or whether it's moving square by square in combat, your group is almost always on the move, and you've got to be cognizant of the rules. Make sure, this is one of those sections where I will say, do what you can to commit the rules of movement to memory, because they're always used. And they're not that complex. In the grand scheme of things, these are some of the easier ones to kind of sink your teeth into and get into your memory banks, okay? So the environment, falling, suffocating, vision and light. These are important things. Now we're getting a little bit more into DM meat. Everything up to this point is common knowledge. Your players should be aware of it, and you should be aware of it. And previously, in the start of the series, I'd made a big deal about emphasizing to your players they have the responsibility of learning how to play their character. That's going to include movement rules. That's going to include tracking time. That's going to include all the combat stuff for their roles. You should have a little bit of weight lifted off your shoulder because you're getting 3 or 4 people confirming the rule because they all know the same thing, right? So, but at the same time, that's one of those, maybe we read this together in session 0. Let's talk about all of the little things. Your session 0 could turn into a 5-hour ordeal, but, at least you're being clear, right? Vision and light. Vision is huge. Line of sight. If you watch any of my Twitch streams, when I'm planning encounters and drawing maps, you hear me constantly refer to line of sight, constantly referring to vision, constantly referring to cutting off line of sight said vision. Blind sight, dark vision, true sight, all of these things are covered here. Make sure you understand how dark vision works. A lot of people assume that that's like, I can see in the dark perfectly, and it's really not. With the spinified range, a creature with dark vision can see in darkness as if the darkness were dim light. So areas of darkness are only lightly obscured. However, the creature can't discern color in darkness, only shades of gray. So it's starlight scope. If you're familiar with the starlight scope effect of modern night vision goggles, that's kind of what they're just talking about. They're not talking about thermal vision. You dudes ain't running around with predator vision with dark vision. That's one of the big hang-ups that I've got to go reread your description in the book. That's not how dark vision works. So dark vision, blind sight, true vision, those are a couple things that make sure you're familiar with, because your players are going to throw those around all the time to try to gain an upper hand. And, that's a rule-specific thing. Food and water. Make sure your characters are eating and drinking. If you want to be very logistics about it, or if you're doing a survival-driven campaign, then food and water become a big deal. If your party is never more than 10 miles away from civilization, then you may not, and your campaign's not going too far, you may not have to worry about tracking food and water. But it is there. Your party's supposed to eat and drink, otherwise they get exhaustion. Interacting with objects. Simple to resolve. The player tells the character his or her doing something that describes what happens. We'll get into a little bit more on this in combat, but there are some interactions that are actually considered actions versus free actions. Again, we're going to do an entire segment on just combat terminology. Just going through rules that you need to understand before you sit down at session 0. But yeah, you do need to understand the free action rule. That we'll get to that soon. Please, please, please don't go, okay, I've listened to episode 1, I'll do this. I'm listening to episode 2, I'll do that. Now, the series is going to be, a body of work. Hopefully by episode 4 or 5, you're able to start and everything else goes from there. But we'll see as it goes. So, disclaimer there, business disclaimer. This isn't a step-by-step. This is a collection of thoughts. Role-playing. Role-playing is what the game is all about. How are you going to manage your role-playing? That's going to be its own segment. But there is some description given in the basic rules. Once again, what I'm trying to emphasize during this segment of DM Chat, how to DM, is the rules are available. This is some of the prep that you're going to need to do. You need to do the bare minimum of at least reading through the basic rules once or twice. If you're not sure on something in there, read it again. You don't need to memorize, but you need to be confident that you understand the concept. You can always refer back, but you're going to lose the flow of the game. You're going to lose the confidence of your table if you've got to go look up a rule every single time it pops up. So that is the impetus on us as Dungeon Masters. Make sure that we're a storehouse of knowledge. You get that through reading, listening to podcasts, watching videos, whatever your preferred learning method is. Use it and absorb this stuff. Be confident in it. Recuperating research training, next to nothing. Don't worry about downtime activities early on. There is some information given in basic that you can expand upon, but that is certainly not a day one thing. Next chapter, combat. Again, I don't want to. This will be its own segment in this series. But just really briefly, there are rules given for combat. All of your basic rules to understand here. You've heard me talk about initiative, bonus actions, reactions, moving between attacks, using different movement speeds, difficult terrains. All of the strange little questions that'll pop up, they're covered here. Not all of them, most of them. We talk about the free action idea. These are things that you can do along with your movement and action. Drawing or sheathing a sword, not drawing or. Opening or closing a door, withdrawing a potion from your backpack. I call bullshit on that one. If you're already moving and fighting, digging a potion out of your backpack, that's going to take longer than 6 seconds. Point being, these are examples. These aren't hard and fast rules, but you're going to have more confusion early on between an action and a free action than you will anything else in combat. A lot of times your player's going to want to do some, and use your common sense on it. If it's like, I could do that while I'm defending myself in a fight, then it's a free action. If it's, I'd actually have to put my weapon down and do this while something's attacking me and probably get hit, it's not going to be free action. Free actions are designed for combat use. If you're not in initiative, if you're not in combat, it doesn't have to be a free action. Your players say, I'm going to open the door. And we're not using action economy at that point, okay? You'll have one thing, is that listed here? We'll find out. Creature size, important. Like I said, I don't want to go paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence right now. I want to say something for the combat sequence. But I am, like I said, once again, emphasizing everything you need to know for day one dungeon mastering is sitting here freely available in the basic rules. All you need to do is read. There's a lot of nuance that goes into it, but you got to start. Cover, damage and healing, all kinds of your basics. Underwater combat is barely touched upon. You need to go in the DM's guide for more on that. We'll get on. This isn't basic at that point, okay? Chapter 9 of your basic rules. Read it and reread it. The only thing you need to, between skill checks, movement, and combat rules, that's the majority of, and then spellcasting, those 4 tenets are going to be 80% of what you're educating in a session. The other 20% is personality, management, describing the scenes, engaging the party, all that. 80% of what you're going to be doing is ability checks, combat, and spellcasting, and I already did ability checks, didn't I? That's gonna be the vast majority of it can be summed up in those three things. So spellcasting gets a little bit scary. There is a lot more that goes on into here, and once again, new dungeon masters, read this section in the basic book, reread it in the player's handbook if you're into that. Oh, disclaimer, caveat: dungeon masters, if you're really getting into it, start with the player's handbook. Don't start with the Dungeon Master's Guide, okay? You're not going to learn how to run a game. You're not going to learn the rules for dungeon mastering for D&D. You will not learn the Dungeons & Dragons rules from the Dungeon Master's Guide. You learn those from the player's handbook. The player's handbook gives you the rules that everyone follows. Dungeon Master's Guide is a little bit more of interpretations, how to build a world, how to do all of this in-depth look on magic items, stuff like that. So don't feel like you got to read the Dungeon Master to be a guide to be a dungeon master. You got to read the basic rules, and you got to read the player's handbook to be an effective dungeon master. Reading the DMG is more to honestly, it's a better source to answer specific questions about running an adventure, not rules. Okay, I got to emphasize that. Emphasize. We're looking at. Sorry, let me go back to view my all sources. Go back to basic rules. This is my complete digital library. I do have all the D&D 5 ebooks on, shared with my play group. Read the vast majority of them, for better or worse. So yeah, a lot of what I'm telling you, you don't have to do. I feel hypocritical because I overconsume, I overread, I overprepare. The flip side of the coin of the lazy DM. We both exist. We both exist in the same world. Their tables are just as satisfied as my table. Doesn't mean they're wrong. Doesn't mean I'm wrong. Doesn't mean I'm right. Doesn't mean they're right. Different styles for different dungeon masters. Different styles within your play group for different adventures. That's when you hit the next tier on being a DM, is when you can manage 3 different campaigns with 3 different themes, 3 different groups of players, and they feel differently. You know, that to me, that's peak DMing. You know, if your players stop and look, why don't we just turn this one off and play the other one because they're too similar? You're not doing a good job. I digress. That was a little editorial comment there. So the rules of magic. We're going to spend another segment on understanding components, verbal material, somatic, when you can, when you can't. There's a ton of nuance. I was about to say, I would honestly say if there's any facet of D&D, of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons that gets misunderstood and abused the most, it's magic. Either your players, I feel bad for saying this, but I've got a couple players that I've been with for years that still will only read the section of the spell they want to apply, as if I don't know how to read, or as if I don't even know the fucking spell. Handle that with a little bit of grace as a dungeon, especially when you're new. If you're new and the whole table's new, don't assume people are trying to get one over on you or get one over on the table. It happens all the time in spellcasting because this is where you get into the linguistics, the legal reading thereof. Pay attention to the periods. Pay attention to the commas. Pay attention to the punctuation in the spell description, because simply by ignoring that, it changes the wording of the entire thing. Yes. This is where I'm going to say that you as a dungeon master will get bogged down in most of your theory crafting and linguistic/legal arguments is when it comes to spellcasters. The more intelligent your player, the more manipulative their intellect, the more time you're going to have to spend dealing with this. This refers back to what I was talking about yesterday, or in the first episode, excuse me. When you invest in your players, when you invest in your people, and you come up with a modicum of mutual respect, a lot of the concerns I'm talking about will be diffused. If you don't have a rapport, if you don't have anything, if your table is looking like it's a competition, DM versus player, then you need to fully expect every one of your spellcasters to manipulate the terminology and the wording of their spell to try to get one over by you. I don't know, man. Maybe that makes me a bad person, but I have very few magic users that haven't tried to pull one off. You know, and in some cases, I love it because it's creative use of the spell. It's a little bit outside of the box of the text, but you're giving me good logic with it, so I'll let it go. We'll talk. This is, as you're seeing, you're going, huh? Wait a minute. There's a lot of nuance that goes into spellcasting. That'll probably take us up 2 segments of this series to really get into an in-depth discussion on spellcasting. So, basic rules. Plan on spending a lot of time in the spell section. Do not worry about memorizing every spell. Look at 1 or 2 spells from each of the classes to understand the themes behind them, understand the consistency in the spells. We're going to break apart a dozen spells. I'm also going to bring up some of the problem ones from my experience to describe to you guys and kind of help you kind of walk around when your player does this. This is what they mean. This is what you can do, hypothetically. So anyway, monsters. This is it, man. This is the bread and butter. This is why your party is going into dungeons. They may be going for for loot. They may be going to do some cool treasures and tricks and traps, but at the end of the day, they're there to fight some big badass monsters. This is where a lot of DMs vary on what they need to know. I am of the mindset that the more you know, the better. Does that mean you need to memorize stat blocks? Hell no. Hell no. Your party will memorize, your players will memorize stat blocks, and then you get to start doing some homebrew. Love it when your group swings and I swing a 13 to hit the skeleton. You miss. What do you mean I miss? The skeleton's got an armor class of 12. Says who? Says the monster manual. So why are you metagaming? Why are you, oh, blah, 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 blah. You've got to learn how to balance that, because as a dungeon master, I never want to dissuade my party from reading. I never want to deter my party from getting more into the game and into the hobby. And if that means they're reading the monster manual because there's some cool pictures and some good stuff, please do it. But then your players have the responsibility of not bringing that to the table, knowing that as their character. And then you have the responsibility of jacking up every armor class by 8 and doubling the hit points when your players start doing that. So now they're back into we don't know what we're doing mode. That's a bit extreme of an example, but hopefully you get my gist. We'll talk about that definitely in the monster stat block, all that kind of stuff. Lots of tables. Now, some of these things that you're looking at here, these are actually given for you to homebrew monsters. Even early on in Basic, they give you opportunities to adjust the stats and the abilities of creatures, even to the point of coming up with the plus rolls based on their difficulty classes and levels, all that. Vulnerabilities, resistances, immunities, senses, blind sight, tremor sight. We saw that over in the player stuff. Language, telepathy. How does telepathy work? Challenge rating. This will be, we'll go deeper into CR as part of the combat segment of this thing. Challenge rating is an important thing to start with, but it means less and less as you and your party gain more experience. It's a baseline. You want to be familiar with the concept when you first start dungeoning mastering, and after that point, it's merely a reference. Then you've got all your special traits. There's a lot of stuff that goes into monsters. Okay, lots of rules about monsters. This is your reading as a dungeon master. This is where you really sit down and roll your eyes and most of it is repetitions that we've already seen. This is how the rules that work for the players apply to the monsters. Basically, that's what you're seeing here. Skill entry is reserved for monsters that are proficient in one or more skills. If you're running a rogue, if the party's fighting with a rogue NPC, they're going to have a higher stealth as a bonus, for example, so on and so forth. So this is a thick section. Once again, an example of the amount of content that you need to read. Don't try to memorize all of this. Be familiar with the concepts, because here's the fun thing. Let's just pull up a monster stat block. Gargoyle, gelatinous cube. I'm trying to find something big and boss. Giant. This is a preview. We're gonna read it. By the way, when you catch my combat section, you'll get a reiteration on all this. Okay, Glabrizu. This is a nice big one. Demon. Armor class is given. Every number that you need to know as a dungeon master is given as part of this stat block. You know what it's resistant to. You know what it's got pluses and minuses on its savings throws. You've got all the strength checks, immunities, conditions, something else that we'll get to later. True sight, spell casting. Everything you need to run this monster is broken down in the monster stat block. So you don't have to memorize anything but the terminology that transcends creatures. Movement, ability, stuff like that. Even then, if we're looking at here, giant wolf spider. Spider climb. I didn't remember what that meant. It just simply tells you. They climb difficult surfaces, including upside down on ceilings, without needing to make ability checks. Because they have the speed of climbing, they're not slowed down going up vertical surfaces or along the roof. Everything you need. So even though I was starting the whole thing out of this is where you're going to do a lot of your reading, that is true. The monster stat blocks are going to be where you invest a lot of your reading when you're setting up your encounters. You're not investing memory. You don't have to memorize all of the stats of every monster. You don't have to memorize any of the stats of any monster. As long as you have access to the stat block, you're good to go. You need to remember what climbing is versus swimming. You need to remember where to find their saving throws. You need to understand, the DC involved when something hits you with a poison, but that's even in the stat block too. So don't panic. Don't be going, oh my God, that's too much to learn. No. We've been going for about 45 minutes here. We're just going through the basic rules. There is a lot to learn. You don't have to do it all at once. I think I've been pretty good. So anyway, building combat encounters. This is more the Dungeon Master's Toolbox type of a thing. Feel free to read through here. If anything, I would say don't worry. Day one, don't worry about building combat encounters. Don't worry about magic items. All of that's going to be in the pre-made module that you're using. If you're trying to build from scratch day one, we'll talk about that later. You're asking for trouble. In addition to trying to maintain and learn how to administer the game, educate all the rules, include and incorporate the characters. You're also trying to present an entire setting from scratch as a brand new dungeon master. Give yourself the levity to learn how to run the game before you try to build your old world. Now, all of that is to be said is that's what Chapter 13 is for. Setting up combat encounters, building encounters, modifying to adjust for difficulty. These are your baseline rules. That was what I was talking about in regards to combat rating. What I describe CR as is the CR for a given encounter is taken into account if the players don't know what they're doing. If they are capable of doing their minimum function as a group, they should be able to survive this encounter. If your players know how to synergize, if they know how to use buffs and debuffs, then combat rating means shit. They're always going to punch above their weight. Okay, but you have to have a baseline. You have to have a starting point. So that's what your CR is for. One thing that I'm definitely going to point out, running the game is a good section to help you out. It goes into a little bit more details for the random shit. What happens if someone wants to attack a stone wall? I got more class 17. That's not because it's hard to hit. That's because it's hard to damage type of a thing. Hit points for objects. How do you interact with different objects? Traps. Using traps in play. Different types of severity of damages. Setback is their term for using damage, using stat bonus, using time. What are you trying to do with the trap? Kill them. You're trying to hurt them. Poisons. Where's my conditions? Oops, sorry. Conditions. Appendix A. This is a group of stuff that you need to have on hand, if not memorized. Conditions are what add to the combat. We're attacking hit points, but sometimes we're paralyzing somebody. Sometimes we're blinding somebody. Sometimes a creature is invisible. What does it mean to be prone? All of that stuff is listed in your conditions. I'm not going to go too far into it right now, but be aware of them. Be absolutely aware of them. So, the next section is Gods of the Universe and the 5 factions, the planes of existence. That's just a little bit more fluff. That's more DM stuff to add to your campaign. So, building on what I've said before, if you're wanting to get into Dungeons and Dragons with your friends and family, you have 0 cost of entry. You can download a set of the basic rules for free, which is going to give you everything we've been talking about, plus a couple sections that you hadn't seen. They'll even help you flesh out your world as far as that goes. The basic rules are available for your players as well. Make sure to hold your players responsible for learning how to play your characters. You do not want to be the guy at the table that has to know every rule for everybody. Number one, that engages your players. They feel like they're equals at the table. Number two, that absolves you of some of the responsibility to having to know everything. And if everyone's agreeing on a rule, then there's no need to look it up and argue about it. Even if it's wrong, that becomes a home rule. Something for later. So, yeah, lots of stuff to mess around with. The basic rules book is the best place to start. You need to read this prior to your session 0. You need to understand these rules before you even sit down to decide, I want to run an adventure. I'm going to do Lost Mines. I'm going to do Curse of Strahd. I've never DM'd before, but I'm going to run an epic campaign. But I don't know what turn order is yet. Stop. Breathe. Figure out your rules. Promise you, once you start learning the rules, maybe certain aspects of adventures mean more to you when you understand how things work. A lot of times, I've seen people work backwards. They'll get the cool adventure book, they'll read through it, and they'll decide they want to DM it, and then they'll learn how to DM as they go. Man, you're doing a disservice to yourself, your group, and that published adventure if you do that. You know, respect your own time. Respect your players' time. Make sure that you're confident in the rules before you sit down to do anything else. Confident does not mean memorized. Confident does not mean rules lawyer. Confident means that if a player says, I'm not sure if this is a bonus action or an action, that you can tell them this is a bonus action, that's an action. things like that. That's what I mean to in regards to confidence. Doesn't mean you have to have every spell known, but it means you have to know have a grasp of the written word well enough to say, okay, but you misread this line in that spell. What that means is this. That's what I mean by confidence in the rules. That's not memorization. Confidence in the rules, knowledge of the rules, and memorization are two different things. Please, please, please don't ever beat yourself up thinking that you have to have memorization. You have to have familiarity and confidence. That's where it starts. Memorization comes, just like everything else, with repetition. Day one, first time you sit down, you're going to fumble the ball. You're going to feel bad. You're going to stutter. You're going to feel like I'm doing the worst job possible. But guess what? If your party is having fun, if you guys have laughed, and if they're ready, okay, man, that was great. We'll see you next week. You won at D&D, despite what you think you did a good job. So don't get so bogged down in the minutia that you're not enjoying the actual event as well. That's why I really try to emphasize to new dungeon masters, trash the idea of memorization. Familiarization and confidence in the mechanics are what you need. Memorization comes later. Memorization comes through repetition. But I was going to try really hard to keep these all under an hour, and at the risk of doing so, actually pulling it off this time, I'm probably going to go ahead and finish this quick recording out. Basic rules. This is your starting point as a dungeon master and as a player for 5th edition. These are freely available, whether through D&D Beyond, a plethora of other websites. I know people are out there are smart. You can figure out how to get whatever you want for however you want. Argument saved for another day. Get access to the basic rules. Make sure you've read through them a couple times. At least once, make sure that you've read through the combat section, the magic section, and definitely the combat section, the magic section, at least twice, maybe 3, until you're comfortable with it. That's where most of your hangups will be in your first couple sessions, is handling combat, handling the combat encounter, turn order and sequence, and managing the use of magic. So if I'm going to close out anything, if you're going to spend extra time on anything in the basic rules, go through Chapter 9 Combat, go through Chapter 10 Spellcasting. Those are your big must, for my personal recommendation. Those are going to save you familiarity, and confidence in those sections will save you a lot of table time arguments and misery. But all right, man. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up our little chat here. This is just episode 2. We're just talking basic rules. My next one I'll probably get done either later today or tomorrow. We're gonna start out with session -1. Now that we've talked about the basic rules that you need to understand as a dungeon master, what do you need to have on hand before you sit down at session -1? The next step of planning. We're going to assume at this point that you've read the rules. For the next episode, we're going to assume that you've read the rules, you're familiar, you're confident with the rules. So what's next? So what's next is going to be session -1, which is the DM prep for session 0. So, appreciate you. You guys like, follow, subscribe if you've enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear back from you as you're following along. If you guys have questions, anyone, whether you're a veteran DM, new DM, drop it in the comments, man. I promise you, I'm checking them on look, and I'd be more than happy to set up a segment, a stream, an episode to discuss that and address that. Any particular thing that you might need. Maybe you're a DM and you're kind of like, I'm most of the way there, but I have a specific question about that. Throw it in the comments. I'd be happy to drop it into this playlist as well. But you know what, guys? Whether you've been here for 5 minutes, whether you've been here for the full hour, thank you for sharing your time with me. DMGeezerjim over here on YouTube. You can catch me live for chats over on my Twitch channel, same handle, DMGeezerjim. If you want to support our operations, I've got a lot of published maps over on Etsy. I've got a few things over on DM's Guild. That's going to actually be under Geezer 105, but everything else is DMGeezerjim. But yeah, support me on Etsy, support me on Patreon, Facebook, YouTube's, all of that kind of stuff. Likes, follow, subscribes. If you know anybody that might like this information, feel free to share the videos, man. We're out here to share and to share the joy of the game and to help grow the population of dungeon masters, and by proxy grow the amount of games that are available. That's all I'm trying to build into, in addition to creating content. But hey, thank you. You guys be safe, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Bye-bye.